Welcome back. Today we are going to take a look at Estrella, and of course Estrella is the latest collaboration from ZiiGaat and Jay. That is Jay of Jay's Audio Reviews. And before we begin, I do want to thank both of these parties for first allowing me to hear this set and to talk about it, and for ZiiGaat to take a chance on another member of our community. We get to hear his point of view on tuning and drivers and all of those things, and it's always great to have a fresh point of view on what he likes, what he prefers, and to hear that embodied into a very nice build that you get on Estrella. This of course, is a dual dynamic driver for balanced armature, and the name kind of refers to stars. So when you look at the black resin, there actually is some glitter or something sparkly in there, and again, that's just kind of a nice theme. They put a really nice build together, kind of exactly what you would expect from ZiiGaat in their hybrids. You get a ZiiGaat cable, which I think is their stock cable they probably use before to get the ZiiGaat case. And again, I think Jay actually did the right thing here. Instead of putting money into a super fancy cable and maybe increasing the retail price of the set, put money into the drivers. The money was better spent there, and I 100% agree with it. You can nitpick it and say it's a black thin cable, but I think he allocated money exactly where it should have been allocated to. And we'll talk about that in particular now as we kind of jump into it and talk about what's in the shells and how it sounds. And I will say right off the bat, those of you who followed the launch of this set, you know that Jay released it and then talked about the tape mod. The tape mod was probably more along the lines of his original idea on the prototype set, and then he changed it based on feedback and added more bass to it. So I will say that I am primarily going to talk about the lower bass version. That is the version I prefer. Perhaps it's the version that Jay prefers as well. But yeah, I think the stock tuning, I think there'll be plenty of reviews talking about the stock tuning. Wasn't really my favorite way to listen to it, so I will pretty much talk about the mods. So what does the stock tuning? I think it was too sub bass heavy. It's kind of similar to DaVinci in that way, more of a fun than quality bass. It was kind of a off balance, really heavy sub bass sound. I think DaVinci was in that ballpark as well. And I typically say this about hybrids. I paid to hear for balanced armatures. I want to hear them. I don't want to hear them buried in bass, and that's sort of what you get on the stock tuning. It's great if you are a bass head or like lots of bass, or you like to have a much more of a bass focus on your hybrids. That stock tuning is going to be for you. So on the tape mod, kind of the way Jay described it as this, you put a piece of clear tape right over here. There's a vent here, and you can kind of see the blue kind of sticking through the vent there. So if you put clear tape over it, that obstructs all the airflow from that vent. That will remove most of the sub bass that I said was too much, and that switches to a more mid bass, brighter sound. It definitely turns into a quick hitting, faster paced style presentation with a little bit more treble. It definitely shifts more upstream, more up range on the sound, because you're getting rid of a whole lot of low end by obstructing the vent. So the micropore mod, which is essentially what you see here and why you can see through it. So micropore tape, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a very porous style tape used for medical purposes. But as you can see, you can pretty much see right through it, and it functions more like a tuning filter as opposed to clear tape, which has no airflow. This will allow some airflow, and I will say it gives you, I don't know, the best of both worlds, but it's a in between both of those styles. So you do get a lowered bass shelf, so not quite as much sub bass. You get a more impactful mid bass because you've cycled down or you've lowered the sub bass. That brings out a clearer mid bass, and it's still going to be slightly bright like the tape mod. And this is the way. This is the way I listen to it. This is the way I enjoy it. This is the way that I'm going to talk about it pretty much from this point on. So I think the $1 million question or the $1,000 question or $500 question, I don't actually know what Jay said originally, but is it the Kilobuck killer? And I think that's kind of what people want to know, right? And my personal view on this is not every $100 set doesn't have to sound like $300. Every $300 set doesn't have to sound like $500 or $1,000. There's a point at which a set is executed and delivers a tuning that is appropriate for the price, and that's kind of a really nice starting point. And of course, Estrella actually hits that with no problems. But then there are hybrids which kind of present characteristics of more expensive sets. And I actually talked about this with Pilgrim Noir, right? It has drivers, very nice drivers, and it has a tubeless balanced armature, and it presents a sound that, while that set was expensive, it sounds like more expensive sets because it has a combination of drivers and tuned in a way that brings that forward. I would say exactly the same thing about Estrella. It has a combination of Sonian and Knowles drivers, and that mix is sort of unique at this price point, and it sounds different. But when we look at the dynamic driver, again, I've talked about dynamic drivers on hybrids quite a bit. It's usually the foundation of a dynamic driver. If you can't get the dynamic driver right and tuned properly, the rest of it doesn't really matter as much. It's sort of the crumbling foundation. You can put some nice balanced armatures on top of a slow dynamic driver, and it will never really sound right. It will never sound above its price point. But I think Jay actually picked a quite nice dynamic driver. It does do rumble, it does do impact, and it does do tactility. You've got to mod it a little bit to bring down the level so those things are more clear, but they are there. And again, I think he picked a really nice foundation with the dynamic driver. The 4 balanced armatures, this mix of Sonian and Knowles, it's right on for a refined technical sound, and I would call that the expensive sound. So what that really means is, so Sonian and Knowles, they have almost 2 different tonalities to them. I think Sonian tends to be the more refined edge. It has a more of an analog or organic sound to balanced armatures. Very, very nice balanced armatures. Knowles is sort of the edgier one, the more analytical, harder edge, more technical. And if you blend the two, you end up with a technical refined sound, or a refined technical sound is I think how I put it there. So you blend those two together, right? So you have this softer edge from the Sonian, a more organic, more analog sounding balanced armatures, and then you add in, a little bit of the harder edge to the Knowles, and the two blend together in a very, very nice way. And again, that sounds like a much more expensive set than the price point. So I don't know if it's a Kilobuck killer, I don't know if it's a $500 killer, but I will say that it will present a sound that you probably aren't used to at this price point. So I will back up Jay and say it does sound more expensive. Don't put a price on it, but just kind of express what was different, what you did that was slightly different than other sets that you might find, even from ZiiGaat alone. They don't use, I don't think, in those Syncos and Trace Syncos, they use a different combination of drivers. So I do think that the point here was that whoever picked these drivers, and I assume it was Jay, he really nailed this combination of drivers, and that is something to be proud about and to talk about it. And you don't have to, make claims about it beating other sets. It is what it is. It's a very, very nice mix of drivers, and kind of leave it at that. So I will leave it at that too. But when you lower the bass and you lower it into the sweet spot, again, if you have a dynamic driver with a little bit too much level over where its sweet spot is, it sounds kind of a little extra, a little bit bloated. You lower that down, everything becomes a little bit cleaner. It sounds, you get much better quality out of it. That will reveal more into the mids, and that will actually expose more of the extended solid treble. Again, very nice Sonian. I think there's a Sonian super tweeter in this one. The whole high end is actually quite solid compared to what you might be useful. Again, these sound a little bit more expensive than our price point. And so, I will kind of back up Jay and say it will sound above its price point, without a doubt, just by the tuning and the drivers that he picked. So one thing we can look at is the 5K over 2K, but let's go back 1 second and look at the mods, because I forgot to pull up this graph earlier. So when I talk about the different mods, you can kind of see, for the most part, the only difference you're going to see is in the actual bass shelf. So I would say that Jay's Estrella stock is the one in the blue, and it's sort of the highest one. And again, it's just something that's slightly over. There's just a lot of sub bass, a lot of bass that you notice when you play your music. That's what I noticed. It's a little bit too bass heavy. So Jay's tape mod is the red line, and I think that's pretty much what his glide would look like. I think if he put it onto his target, it's this nice ratio of sub bass to mid bass. And again, this one really brought down the sub bass and pops up the mid bass, and you end up with a really sharp, hard hitting set that's really right here. This doesn't really have the depth that I was looking for, and that's why I sort of preferred the balance between the two, which is the micro pour. So you bring down the sub bass, bring down the bass level in both, but keep it, sort of in that ramp, and that just gives you a better balance of some mid bass that still sounds sharper and some sub bass that gives you the depth and extension. So that's my preference. I mean, Jay obviously likes the glide, so I got no issues with that one. But 5K over 2K, Getting back to that, that is exactly this peak right here. So those of you who are very 5K sensitive, you'll know that this one is right above the Harman target. I tend to use the Harman target not as a target preference, but in this case, it becomes almost like a no-fly zone. Any treble that tends to fly over the Harman target tends to be an area of concern, or one that you should think about your own preferences. For me, I am very sensitive to 5K, and seeing this 5K peak over this 2K, I understand the tuning kind of methodology behind it, and you can see it right here. So Jay bumped out this just a little bit. You can see where it starts a little bit earlier over the Harman target. You just add a little bit extra energy here, and that allows you to do less energy here. So right here, where you're typically going to get the Harman shout, you just put a little bit of energy here, keep this lower, you end up with a shout-free upper mid, and again, I think that is the right move. Adding just a little bit too much energy here for me, but again, that's where you would put detail and a little bit energy. If you're going to keep this lower, you've got to bump out that just a little bit. So I kind of agree with what he did, but I'll just say it's probably just a little bit too high for my preferences. And when you lower the base level here, this becomes more apparent, more audible. And for those of you who are sensitive to it, those of you guys who are in 5K clan, as I said, you will notice it. It's definitely not much of an issue if you're using the stock tuning. It's pretty much under the bass, or the bass helps to kind of soothe out that. But I think it definitely is more noticeable with the mods where you bring down the bass level. So the sound, the micropore mod, it really shifts the balance. It really kind of tips, like I said, out of the box, the tuning is kind of more sub-bass focused. This will tilt it upper range with a slight brightness, but it still has sub-bass glide. It does add body and still adds warmth exactly where you would want it from the low end, but you do end up with a cleaner middle, and that will actually give you more revealing mids. So the bass, again, this micropore mod doesn't drop all of the sub bass, kind of the way Jay's does. There's still some rumble, there's still some depth, there's still fun for bassier genres, but dropping the level does reveal more quality, more texture, sharper impact, and I think that's sort of the bit that I didn't necessarily like about the stock tuning. It's a nice dual dynamic driver, like I said, but you just add just a little bit too much in level, and it becomes really harder to distinguish. I mean, it's a nice bass level for sure. It's lots of fun, but quality-wise, it essentially obscures itself, and you have to bring that down. You bring the level down, and that will reveal more, and that's exactly what happens here. You end up with more texture, sharper impacts. The mid-bass becomes kind of in a better ratio with the sub-bass. The shelf does carry energy from the sub-bass into the mid-bass into the mids. It's not like your typical lean U-shape. Again, I think Jay's Glide, the micropore mod, essentially do both of those things in the same way. I think Jay's is actually kind of purposefully designed to do that. And you might add more micropore if you want more control or a lower level. So again, when you look at the levels on the mods, so when I talk about the ratios and carrying energy into the mids, Jay still has some sub bass, but this becomes quite prominent, this mid bass area, but you do get a nice ratio, and then he is carrying in some energy right into the mids. And this whole transition, having energy from all the way out here all the way through the mids, is the glide. It's a very nice bass shelf and bass style. But when you get down to it, how do you listen to this on a daily basis? The micropore mod will sort of let you add more micropore to it. So if this level is a little too high for you, you can add more micropore, obscure a little bit more air. You'll get a slight lowering of the curve. J's are using plastic tape. You don't really have anywhere to go. It's already blocking all the air. So that's what the micropore will give you, a little bit more wiggle room on adjusting the bass shelf in case one of these doesn't really work for you. But those are some options to look at when you end up with your own Estrella, and you have some micropore tape. So the mids are revealed rather than pushed forward. Again, this whole concept of the mod. So with the stock tuning, lots of bass, it's actually obscuring quite a bit of the mids. When you lower this becomes more audible, more present, more revealed. Typically, what you're going to find in hybrids or just normal IEMs, the mids are pushed a little bit forward, and that's the Harman target, right? You just add a lot more energy up here, that pushes the mids forward. There's more of an upper tilt to them. They're a bit leaner, but they sound more forward. You could rise up a little earlier. That brings them more forward. That is typically the move that most IEMs do, and people are very used to that style sound. When you simply lower the bass level and reveal what's here, it becomes a more natural midsection. You don't have some of this forced sound that you get from the upper mids. This is all lowered, no shout, more natural. Not the super high energy that you get on Harman style, but a really nice no shout. He picked some really nice levels there. And then you just lower this becomes revealed, and it's very, very nice. And again, I think that was sort of the star of the show for me, not necessarily stock tuning, but with the mods, I think that is what you're going to hear. So when you combine this lowering of the bass with the lowered upper mid, like I just talked about, you end up with a cleaner background, these very capable balanced armatures. It presents a really nicely separated, layered, resolving, spatial imaging, all those things that make it an expensive sounding set, all those things that you're expecting to hear from a well-executed, balanced armature, hybrid, and all those things kind of come through. And I think $300 sets are $300 for this reason, not to be covered up with bass. And again, it's sort of one of these nitpicks I had about the stock tuning. The drivers, the two dynamic drivers, and more so the 4 balanced armatures are deceptively good. I won't stop saying that they are very, very nice. This mix of drivers he picked are very, very nice. But on the other hand, I do wish that the mids were the star of the show on the stock tuning and was really tuned around this special set of drivers that he picked, because they're very well executed, but there's this whole bass kind of covering them up, and they're sort of hiding or kind of buried in the mix. And that sort of my least favorite part about the stock tuning was very much that, was he hid the best part of the set, in my opinion, was these balanced armatures. And the treble, I think, like the mids, and for better or worse, the treble is also revealed in the same way. It becomes a little bit more forward with the mods. And on one hand, you really get the great technical capability from these balanced armatures, and you get lots of extension, but it will also sound a little peakier than stock. You don't have all this bass. The bass was actually covering up quite a bit. And when you reveal what's really there in the treble, and it may sound more peakier to you, those peaks will definitely affect the stage and some sibilance and volume scaling. So I do think that the mod, in that respect, it solved one problem. It solved the major problem of revealing what's really there and what's special about Estrella, and I agree. I think the mod is the way to go. But then it caused some other side effects that we'll kind of discuss now, and some ways to address them in the after show. So on the after show, I think the last 10%, the bit that I was just really referring to in the treble, the part that's revealed, that you end up be slightly bright and may not stage properly. Those little bits that really assign the tuning or align the tuning to your HRTF, how you perceive the world, how you expect things to sound, and how it sounds right after the tape mod. Those two may not be in perfect alignment. And for me, it was left slightly too bright, in the same way that Dusk, those of you who have tried Dusk with the analog cable, I thought that it was exactly the same thing. These two sets sound very, very similar when you just put the tape mod on or just put Dusk on the analog. They're both left slightly bright and don't really quite align to my HRTF because they're slightly bright. That brightness will actually affect the stage. It flattens the stage. It sounds a little peakier. It may sound a little bit more sibilant. And it will certainly not volume scale because it sounds a little bit too peaky. So I do think both sets are very similar in that way, and they will become superstar sets if you EQ them and get them more aligned to what your brain and your ears are expecting to hear from, especially the treble level. And we'll kind of talk about some of these things that you can poke at. So this is Fubar's EQ, and I'll probably be even vaguer on this one than I usually am. So I want people to get in the habit of sliding sliders to adjust to their HRTF as opposed to auto EQing to a target that will get you sort of close, but you're sort of no different. Instead of saying that the levels are slightly off from my HRTF because of the tape mod, when you actually smash the signature down to a target, you're essentially in the same position, just the levels are slightly different. Perhaps it sounds better to you, perhaps it does not, but you'll always have to adjust it for your brain and your ears and get these levels to the point where this almost sounds like speakers, where you lose the brightness, you lose the flatness, and it becomes an enveloping 3D, immersive soundstage. And that's exactly what happens on Dusk. That's exactly what happens on Estrella if you kind of poke at the EQ a little bit. So I'll say the sub bass. So under 150 hertz, I went back and forth on this. You can actually add one. So like I said, the micropore tape mod will actually bring the sub bass level down. You can add one into it. That will sound a little bit more fun. You can leave it at 0, which was kind of fine, or you can go down to -1. If you are really into clarity and imaging and all those things that make things sound sharper and more expensive sounding, bring it down even one more level, and that will sort of take out the fun, but will give you a much sharper stage. And so I don't really have any advice as to what I would say. Take 150 hertz and move it up and down and see which one you like better. So 300 hertz, so 200, 300, and 400, these are sort of my go-to for more impact. So like I said, Jay's tape mod actually does this really well. This is sort of the compromise of taking my micropore mod and putting in the little bit of a mid bass that his tape mod did really well. It's a really sharp, quick hitting sound, but I tend to do this exactly on hybrids for this reason. So 200, 300 in particular gives you a slightly more impact, slightly more tactility to the bass, more of a back of the head style hit to the mid bass, and that's what I prefer. So 400 is actually going to affect what was next. So 5 to 7K. So when I said that the treble was more revealing, like I said, there's a little bit of a 5K peak. There's a little bit of there's a little bit to 7K that comes across, and you'll hear that on some of your hard S's, some of your hard C's, some of those hard consonants will kind of sound a little bit sharper. So part of it is 400 is the start of the mids, the lower mids. If you add a little bit of body to the back end to it, this sounds a little bit softer. If you lower the 5K, that those of you who are really into 5K sensitivity, you'll know that that almost pinches your vocals. So it pulls up the middle and it kind of shrinks the sides. So you put some 400. So add a little bit to the lower, make that sound a little bit fuller. Lower the 5K so you don't have that drag up or that pinch to it. And at 7K, those of you who are really sensitive to sibilants and S's and C's and hard consonants, you want to bring that down 1 or 2 again until you don't hear it. Don't go too far down because you will overstep and it won't sound as detailed. But these two are going to be very much a HRTF, a personal preference, how much you notice in these two. So I don't want to, I would probably not. I would play with those a lot. They are very hard to actually get right. And I went back and forth on bringing 7K down more and bringing 5K down more. And then you end up pushing it back up because you notice some apparent loss of detail or resolution or clarity. But yeah, depending on which side of those you notice, you do want to address, at least adjust those. And then over 10K, so I think very much like Dusk, there's, and you can kind of see it against Dusk right here. So in general, you can kind of see exactly what I'm talking about with the treble level on Estrella. It's just a little bit on the upper edge of these 3 sets of Dusk and Da Vinci. So again, when I'm kind of poking at these, I think the 5K bring this down to, closer to where those are. 7K, there's probably some extra there too. And then 10K and up, again, I think Dusk and Estrella basically do the same thing. There's just this upper bit that's kind of way out there that becomes more noticeable when you lower the bass level. When you have the stock tuning, you're probably not going to notice this at all, but when you reveal it, just a little bit too bright for me, a little bit too much of a volume limiter for me. There's just a lot of extra energy out there. So bring down over 10, 1 dB, 2 dB until it's much less noticeable. And for me, this is sort of where you get to the point of these two sets sound very, very close. And, there's some differences. I think the lower end is probably a little bit different because the dynamic drivers are a little bit different. The upper end is certainly a little bit different because Dusk used planar. But yeah, I would probably be happy with either one of them. When you get them dialed in for how you're expecting them to sound and the brightness level that you prefer, both very, very spectacular sets for their price points. So I won't declare a clear winner, but I will say that if you own either one of them, you're doing very, very well. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.